Hey, Brent Porcio, TopVelocity.net. Wanted to do kind of a public service announcement here on a big issue in baseball, overhead lifting, specifically with pitchers, the throwing athletes, the ones that typically throw more consistently. It's conventional wisdom not to lift overhead, right? I want to really address that issue because on the other end in this sport with pitchers, we have a pattern of injury. It's very common that if you pitch long enough in this sport that you're going to injure your shoulder or elbow. So a lot of the studies that are trying to discover the injury links are finding that it's linking to these athletes who throw a lot and typically have weak shoulders, either because they don't do enough strength and conditioning while they're throwing or because the throwing is weak in the arm. And it's actually showing both. Pitchers that come in with less overhead strength or shoulder strength typically are more injured through the season. Pitchers typically have weaker shoulders in the posterior strength measurements than the average public. Pitchers also have weaker shoulders in the same area than position players, kind of providing some type of link to the amount of throwing is probably what's causing the shoulder to weaken over time. We've also have studies showing that pitchers typically, the musculature will actually sag down, creating a higher sulcus sign, which is where the chromium sticks up off the clavicle, higher on the throwing arm than the non-throwing arm. So at this point, if you look at the studies, it's almost becoming very obvious that throwing over time weakens the arm, specifically in the posterior shoulder. That's why we see the internal rotation, range of motion shorten up, because that posterior shoulder is thickening from all that deceleration, wear and tear from the overthrowing, which is what we believe is leading to the injury. So if it's showing that throwing weakens the arm and pitchers have weaker arms than anyone else, even the average public, then how would we strengthen that musculature to prevent that falling into injury, which studies show that falls into injury. Now, I'm a USA Weightlifting Certified Performance Coach, Strength Coach. I'm also finishing my master's in kinesiology. So for strength coaches, we want to come in and strengthen that area. Now, that's the challenge here. It's very conventional and common in baseball that we strengthen with this light tubing, specifically through external rotation, getting into the posterior strengthening. But is that enough? Because those tubes are, the tubing resistance is 15, maybe 30 pounds. It's not a lot of loading that you are putting on that arm to force it to strengthen and adapt to that stress, right? So let's look at what kind of stress is hitting the arm. Studies show that in a high velocity pitcher, when the arm lays back, it has to stabilize up to 60 pounds of force. Studies also show at pitch release, the distraction force, the force pulling the arm out of socket at release can be up to 150% of your body weight. So if you're 200 pounds, that's about 300 pounds of force pulling your arm out of socket. So the question is just taking a light tubing, 15, 30 pound, 40 pound tubing, and pulling it back in external rotation over time, is that enough to force the arm and the shoulder to strengthen posterior the amount of force, say up to 150% of your body weight? I would say no, just being a strength coach and looking at the amount we're forcing the arm to pull back and the amount that the pitch is forcing the arm to pull back is not even close. That's where I'm concerned. So the thing is as strength coaches, we do know we have to strengthen overhead for these athletes that typically have weaker shoulders than the average public, and when they go in weak, if their shoulders going weak for the season, they're typically more injured. So we have to strengthen them. So telling these young kids that they shouldn't be lifting overhead when they're going to put all these distraction forces and stabilization forces on their arm in their skill, I believe is setting them all up for injury. And I believe that's why we have the pattern of injury. We have yet to develop these players correctly to be able to handle all the wear and tear stress the studies show is destroying the arm. So here's the thing, when you start lifting overhead, I understand the concerns, and the concerns are if we take a kid and he's in season, because that's another problem with baseball, they can't get out of season, and he starts lifting overhead, well, it's going to fatigue the arm that typically with their mechanics, they're not total body mechanics at a young age, they're very immature in their use of the kinetic chain, that they are using a lot of their arm, and now their arms are tired from the lifting the day before, and then they have sore arms, maybe hurt arms, because we do have a problem there. ASMI said you're 36 times more likely to have injury if you're throwing fatigue. So if the weights fatigued your arm, yes, you could be more vulnerable to fatigue. But once again, we do have to break down to strengthen up. So we have to somehow avoid the fatigue issue, but still get into the lifting and strengthening and adaptation purpose to avoid the wear and tear injuring the arm over time. So that's the challenge here, and I think coaches throwing the baby out with the bathwater, like, well, we can't just lift overhead because it makes their arms tired and they're always in season, so they can't throw because that can potentially make them more injured. So let's just keep them weak, and hopefully their DNA, their genetics can stay strong and survive. To me, that's ridiculous. So it comes down at the end of the day to programming. It comes down to programming. It comes down to technique. If we can teach these young developing pitchers how and when to lift overhead, typically in an off season, and then maintain through the season like we do with the 3X pitching velocity programs or the 2X programs, that will allow them to strengthen and not fall into the fatigue issue. It also helps them prevent a lot of the fatigue issue because they're getting stronger. And then on top of that, it's the technique. We need to get there and make sure they understand, how are their scaps functioning? Are their scaps moving? Or are they just pushing their humerus overhead without a lot of scapular movement, causing impingements, causing actually injury itself? So correctly, molding correctly, and then we can, through proper programming, strengthen and develop these pitchers to be healthy and to get out of these patterns of injury, or to avoid these patterns of injury, hopefully eliminate these patterns of injury. So I just wanted to kind of do this video as a public service announcement. I could go through some basic technique in the next few videos of how to get the scaps functioning correctly, to allow the overhead to avoid the impingements overhead. Also, how to start off in your programming at lightweight and slowly build up and periodize that, and then go for some really good strength and different types of ways of actually just holding for strength and creating stability, and then pressing for strength overhead, pulling as well. All those things which we do in the 3X programs, 2X programs, I'll like to brush on in the next few videos. But once again, this is a public service announcement. We have to lift these pitchers overhead. It's ridiculous we aren't. We just have to educate ourselves on how it works, and avoid this ignorance of, let's just not do it all together and continue to allow the pattern of injury grow.